"Daddy, what am I going to do now? I need you so much." The desperate voice of the boy cut through the icy morning air, carrying a sorrow so raw it made John's chest tighten. Standing just a few feet away, John held his breath. He had come to the cemetery as he did every week, seeking solace at the grave of his late wife. It was the only place where the chaos of his corporate empire couldn't reach him, a space where he could reflect on his loneliness and the regrets that haunted his life. But today was different. The boy's words pierced through the silence, filling the space with an unbearable sadness. John turned slowly, his sharp blue eyes scanning the snowy cemetery until they landed on the small figure kneeling before a modest gravestone. The boy, no older than 8, clung to the cold stone as if it could bring his father back. His thin frame was shaking, not just from the cold, but from the weight of his grief. John hesitated. He was not a man who intruded in the lives of strangers, but something about the scene before him held him captive. He stepped closer, his leather shoes crunching softly against the frost-covered ground. "Are you all right, son?" His voice, though deep, carried an unfamiliar gentleness. The boy startled, looking up with tear-streaked cheeks and wide brown eyes. "Who are you?" John crouched slightly, trying to appear less imposing. "My name is John. I couldn't help but notice you're alone. Is there someone I can call for you? Your mother, perhaps?" The boy's face crumpled further, and he shook his head. "There's no one. It was just me and Daddy, but now—" He choked on the words, his small hands clutching the gravestone tighter. John's heart twisted in a way he hadn't felt in years. He knelt fully now, eye level with the boy. "What's your name?" "Samuel," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. "Samuel," John repeated, tasting the name as if committing it to memory. "Samuel. How long have you been out here?" Samuel shrugged, his thin shoulders hunched against the biting wind. "I don't know, since they put him here." John's gaze shifted briefly to the gravestone. The dates were fresh, the flowers at the base still unwilted. He read the name, David Turner. It wasn't a name he recognized, but the weight of the loss was evident. "You can't stay here in the cold, Samuel," John said firmly but kindly. "Where do you live?" The boy hesitated, then pointed toward a small house visible beyond the cemetery gates. It was a modest home, its paint chipped and windows slightly fogged from the inside. John stood, brushing frost from his tailored coat. "Come on, let me walk you home. You shouldn't be out here by yourself." Samuel hesitated again, his eyes darting between John and the gravestone. "I don't want to leave him." John swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He understood that kind of pain, the kind that made you cling to memories, even physical places, as if letting go meant losing the person forever. "Your father wouldn't want you to get sick, would he? Let's get you somewhere warm and we can talk more." The boy finally stood, reluctantly taking John's outstretched hand. His grip was small and icy, a stark contrast to John's firm, steady grasp. Together, they walked toward the small house, the weight of silence between them broken only by the crunch of snow underfoot. When they reached the front door, Samuel fumbled with a key that seemed too large for his tiny hands. The inside of the house was as modest as the exterior, a single room serving as a kitchen, living area, and bedroom. A small electric heater buzzed faintly in the corner, but it barely seemed enough to fight off the winter chill. John glanced around, taking in the worn furniture and the stack of unopened bills on the counter. The boy's life was clearly one of hardship, even before his father's death. "Do you live here alone now?" John asked, his voice heavy with concern. Samuel nodded. "Daddy always said I was brave enough to take care of myself." His voice wavered as he tried to sound confident, but his trembling hands betrayed him. John felt a surge of protectiveness he hadn't expected. He had spent his life building skyscrapers, closing multi-million-dollar deals, and amassing wealth most people couldn't fathom. But none of that seemed to matter now. Not in the face of this small boy standing in a house too empty, too quiet, and far too cold. "Samuel," John said gently, "I don't think you should be alone right now. Would you let me help you?" The boy's eyes filled with tears again, but he didn't speak. Instead, he simply nodded. The smallest gesture of hope breaking through his overwhelming grief, John felt something stir within him. Something long dormant. Perhaps this moment, this child, was exactly what he had been searching for without even realizing it. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the heater. John took off his coat, draping it over the back of a chair. Samuel stood in the corner, hugging himself tightly. His small frame seeming even smaller in the dim light of the house, John noticed how the boy's clothes were too thin for the harsh winter outside and made a mental note to address that later. "I'll make us some tea," John said, trying to break the heavy silence. He moved toward the kitchen area, where a single electric stove and a battered kettle sat on the counter. Samuel watched him cautiously, as though unsure whether he could trust this stranger who had suddenly walked into his life. As the water heated, John spoke softly. "How long has it been since your father passed?" Samuel hesitated. His eyes fixed on the floor. "2 weeks, he finally murmured. "I've been okay though, I can take care of myself." John turned, leaning against the counter. "No child should have to take care of themselves, Samuel. Where have you been getting food, money?" Samuel shrugged, his small hands gripping the hem of his shirt. "Daddy had some money saved in a jar. I've been using that, but it's almost gone. I don't need much." The kettle whistled, and John poured the hot water into 2 chipped mugs, stirring sugar into both before handing one to Samuel. The boy held it with both hands, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. As they sipped their tea, John's eyes scanned the room again. It was painfully clear that the boy had been struggling. The blankets on the bed were too thin for the winter, and the fridge hummed softly, but was likely nearly empty. A pang of guilt washed over him. He thought of the wealth he had accumulated over decades, money that afforded him luxuries he no longer cared about, while this child sat here in the cold, trying to survive alone. "You don't have to do this alone, you know," John said after a moment. His voice was firm but kind. "I can help you, Samuel, for now at least, until we figure out a more permanent solution." Samuel's eyes darted toward him, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Why?" John didn't answer immediately. How could he explain to a child that he saw his own loneliness mirrored in him? That the boy's pain had awakened something in him he thought he had buried with his wife years ago. Instead, he said simply, "Because you deserve it. Everyone deserves someone to look after them." Samuel didn't respond. But the tension in his small shoulders seemed to ease slightly. John spent the next hour tidying up the house while Samuel sat quietly at the table, watching him. He didn't have to say it, but John could feel the boy's unease. He was waiting for John to leave, like everyone else had, when John finally sat down across from him again. He spoke with gentle authority. "Samuel, you're coming with me tonight. I have a big house, plenty of space. It's warm, and you'll have a proper bed to sleep in." Samuel's eyes widened in alarm. "I can't leave Daddy's house. What if he comes back? He'll look for me here." John's throat tightened at the boy's innocent words. He leaned forward, his voice soft but unwavering. "Samuel, your daddy would want you to be safe. He'd want you to be warm, to have someone take care of you, don't you think?" The boy's lip quivered, but he nodded slowly. "Then it's settled," John said, standing and pulling his coat back on. "Pack a bag with your things. Whatever's important to you." Samuel moved hesitantly, gathering a small bundle of clothes and a faded photograph from a drawer. As they walked out into the cold night, John placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. The drive to John's estate was quiet, the hum of the car lulling Samuel into an uneasy sleep. When they arrived, the boy's eyes widened as he took in the sprawling mansion, its grand facade glowing softly against the snow. "This is your house?" Samuel asked, his voice filled with awe. John chuckled lightly. "It's home, for better or worse. Come on, let's get you inside." The warmth of the house enveloped them as they stepped through the heavy wooden doors. Samuel looked around in amazement at the high ceilings, the intricate chandeliers, and the plush furniture. To John, the house had always felt empty, a hollow shell filled with things that didn't matter, but tonight, For the first time in years, it felt like a home. John led Samuel upstairs to a guest room, opening the door to reveal a bed with a thick quilt, a small desk, and a window overlooking the snow-covered garden. "This will be your room," John said. "At least for now." Samuel hesitated at the doorway, his small hand clutching the strap of his bag. "Are you sure it's okay? I don't want to be a bother." John knelt down, looking the boy in the eye. "You're not a bother, Samuel. Not now, not ever. You're safe here." For the first time, Samuel smiled, a small, tentative smile that softened the lines of worry on his young face. As John turned to leave, the boy's voice stopped him. "Thank you," Samuel said quietly. John paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Good night, Samuel." As he closed the door, John felt a strange sense of peace. Perhaps, he thought, this boy wasn't the only one who needed saving. The first morning in John's mansion felt surreal to Samuel. The light streaming through the wide windows illuminated the room, making it feel even larger than it had the night before. He sat on the edge of the bed, his small hands gripping the quilt tightly. Everything around him was unfamiliar. The softness of the mattress, the faint scent of lavender in the air, the silence that was neither comforting nor familiar. He was used to waking up to the hum of his father's old radio or the faint creaks of their modest home. John knocked lightly on the door before stepping in, holding a tray with a steaming mug of hot chocolate and a plate of toast. "Good morning, Samuel," he said, his tone warm but not overly cheerful. Samuel blinked up at him, startled by the gesture. "Good morning," he mumbled. "I thought you might like something warm to start the day," John said. Placing the tray on the small desk by the window, he noticed Samuel's nervous glances at the unfamiliar surroundings. "How did you sleep?" Samuel shrugged. "Okay, I guess." John didn't push. He sat in the chair opposite the desk, watching the boy take tentative sips of the hot chocolate. "I thought we could spend the day together. Maybe take a walk around the property. There's a garden out back that I think you'll like." Samuel nodded, though his expression remained guarded. He wasn't sure what to make of this man who seemed so different from anyone he'd ever met. After breakfast, John led Samuel through the sprawling mansion, pointing out rooms and paintings, though he quickly realized the grandeur of his home was overwhelming for the boy. When they stepped outside into the crisp winter air, Samuel's face lit up for the first time. The garden, though covered in a thin layer of snow, was enchanting. The tall trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches sparkling with frost, and a small fountain in the center was frozen into a delicate sculpture. Samuel ran ahead, his boots crunching through the snow, and stopped by the fountain. "It's so pretty," he said, his voice filled with wonder. John smiled, watching him. "It's my favorite part of the house. My wife loved it too." Samuel turned, his small face serious. "You miss her, don't you?" John's chest tightened at the boy's perceptiveness. "Every day," he admitted. "But being here, it helps me remember her. The good times, you know." Samuel nodded, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I try to remember the good times with Daddy. I do, but it's hard. I just feel alone." "You're not alone anymore, Samuel," John said gently. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Samuel didn't respond, but something in his expression softened. Later that afternoon, as they warmed up by the fireplace, Samuel began to open up. He told John about his father, how he used to make pancakes on Sundays, how he worked long hours at the factory, but always came home with a smile. "He said we didn't need much because we had each other," Samuel said, his voice trembling. John listened intently, his heart aching for the boy. It was clear that David Turner had been a good man, one who loved his son deeply. But it also raised questions. How had someone like David ended up working in such dangerous conditions, and why had no one stepped in to help Samuel after his death? That evening, John retreated to his study, his mind racing. He had built his fortune through countless companies, each with its own network of employees and contractors. He prided himself on being a fair employer, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed somewhere along the way. He needed answers. He made a call to his assistant, instructing her to dig into the records of the factory where David Turner had worked. As he hung up the phone, he stared out the window at the snow-covered garden. Illuminated by the moonlight, a pang of guilt gnawed at him. For all his wealth and power, he had been blind to the struggles of people like Samuel and his father. The next morning, his assistant's call came quickly. "The factory was subcontracted, Mr. Anderson," she explained. "It's a small operation. The accident that killed Mr. Turner involved a poorly maintained machine. There were safety violations reported months before, but nothing was done." John's jaw tightened. "And the boy, why didn't anyone step in to help him after his father's death?" "The house they lived in was rented through the factory's owner," she continued. "When Mr. Turner died, the rent payments stopped. The landlord started eviction proceedings, but it seems the boy managed to stay hidden. It's a tragic situation." John hung up, his mind made up. He couldn't undo the past, but he could make sure Samuel never felt abandoned again. That evening, as they sat by the fire, John looked at Samuel, who was busy sketching on a piece of paper. "Samuel," he said, his voice steady, "I've been thinking. I want you to stay here with me, not just for now, but for as long as you need. This can be your home." Samuel froze, his pencil hovering over the paper. "You mean, like forever?" John nodded. "If that's what you want, I know I can never replace your father, but I'd like to try to be someone you can count on, someone who cares about you." The boy's eyes filled with tears, and he quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. "I'd like that," he whispered. John reached out, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, a feeling that perhaps, despite his mistakes, he could make a difference. John's promise to Samuel marked the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. In the following days, the boy began to adjust to life in the mansion, though he often clung to his small bundle of belongings like a lifeline. His cautious demeanor softened little by little as John made every effort to ensure he felt safe and welcome. One afternoon, as the snow fell lightly outside, Samuel ventured into the library, a vast room filled with towering bookshelves and plush chairs. He ran his fingers over the spines of the books, marveling at their titles, when John walked in. "Do you like to read?" John asked, his voice breaking the quiet. Samuel nodded shyly. "Daddy used to read to me before bed. I liked the stories about heroes." John smiled, pulling a worn book from one of the shelves. "This was one of my favorites when I was a boy. It's about a young knight who finds courage when he least expects it." He handed the book to Samuel, who cradled it as if it was something precious. "Maybe we can read it together," John offered. Samuel's eyes lit up, and for the first time he asked, "Could we start tonight?" That evening, as they sat by the fire, John read aloud from the book, his deep voice bringing the story to life. Samuel listened intently, his head resting against the arm of the chair. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of normalcy, as if the weight of his grief had lifted just a little. But their newfound peace was soon interrupted. One evening, while John was in his study, his assistant called with unsettling news. "Mr. Anderson, I've uncovered something about Samuel's situation." She began, her tone hesitant. "It seems there's a relative, a woman claiming to be his aunt, who's petitioned for custody." John's grip on the phone tightened. "What do we know about her?" "She's his father's estranged sister, but there's no record of her having been involved in Samuel's life before now. She's also in significant financial trouble, which raises questions about her intentions." John's jaw clenched. "Do whatever it takes to delay any proceedings. I need time to sort this out." When he hung up, his mind raced. He had seen Samuel begin to trust him, to find comfort in their new routine. The thought of someone taking him away now was unthinkable. The next morning, John sat Samuel down at the breakfast table. "There's something I need to talk to you about," he began carefully. "Your father had a sister. She's come forward, saying she wants to take care of you." Samuel's fork clattered against his plate. "I don't even know her," he said, his voice trembling. "I know," John said gently, "and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you stay here with me, but we might have to face some questions. People wanting to know what's best for you." Samuel's eyes filled with tears, and he looked at John with a mix of fear and desperation. "I don't want to go with her. I want to stay here, with you." John reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on the boys. "And I want you to stay here, too, but we have to be strong, Samuel. Together we'll get through this." The weeks that followed were tense. John's lawyer began preparing for a custody hearing, gathering evidence to prove that Samuel's best interests were with him. Meanwhile, John dug deeper into the aunt's background, discovering a trail of unpaid debts and questionable associates. Samuel, unaware of the full extent of the battle being waged on his behalf, found comfort in their nightly reading sessions and the quiet moments spent in the garden. But the fear of being taken away never truly left his eyes on the day of the hearing. John dressed in his finest suit, his face a mask of calm determination. Samuel, dressed in a borrowed jacket and tie, clung to John's hand as they entered the courthouse. The courtroom was stark and intimidating, its walls lined with polished wood. The aunt sat across the room, her gaze sharp and calculating. John could see the greed behind her feigned concern, and it only strengthened his resolve. As the hearing began, the judge listened to arguments from both sides. The aunt's lawyer painted her as a loving relative, eager to step in and provide a stable home for Samuel. John's lawyer countered with evidence of her financial troubles and lack of prior involvement in the boy's life. When it was Samuel's turn to speak, the room fell silent. The boy's small frame seemed even smaller as he stood before the judge, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "I don't know my aunt," he said softly, his voice trembling. "She's never been there for me, but John, he's taken care of me. He reads to me at night, and he makes me feel safe. I want to stay with him." The judge regarded Samuel with kind eyes, nodding slightly before turning her attention back to the lawyers. Hours later, the decision was announced. John was granted temporary custody with the promise of a follow-up hearing in 6 months. Relief washed over him as he pulled Samuel into a hug. "We're going home," John whispered that night as they sat by the fire. Samuel looked up at John. "Do you think Daddy would be okay with this, with me staying with you?" John placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice steady. "I think your daddy would want you to be happy and safe, and I promise you, Samuel, I'll do everything I can to make sure of that." The months following the custody hearing were transformative for both John and Samuel, though the ruling was temporary. It gave them a sense of stability, a chance to breathe. Samuel began to settle into his new life, his smiles growing more frequent and his laughter finally echoing through the once silent halls of John's mansion. But for John, the battle wasn't over. The thought of the 6-month review loomed over him. He was determined to prove to the court and to Samuel that their bond wasn't temporary. One crisp spring afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Samuel asked, "Do you think they'll let me stay forever?" John knelt down, meeting Samuel's gaze. "I'll do everything in my power to make that happen. But no matter what, you'll always have a place with me. You're family now, Samuel." Samuel's eyes glistened with tears. But he didn't cry. Instead, he nodded, his small hand slipping into John's. As the months passed, John took great care to prepare for the next hearing. He met with social workers, ensured Samuel was excelling in school, and even began learning how to cook the boy's favorite meals, though his first few attempts ended in laughter and burnt pancakes. One evening, while sorting through some old files in his study, John found an envelope addressed to Samuel. It had been tucked inside a box of papers from the factory where David had worked. Curious, John called Samuel into the room. "I found something you might want to see," he said, handing the envelope to the boy. Samuel hesitated, his fingers trembling as he opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter from his father, dated just weeks before his death. "Dear Samuel," it began, If you're reading this, it means I'm not there with you anymore. I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've always been my greatest joy and my biggest reason to keep going. Life won't always be easy, but you're strong, stronger than you know. And no matter where I am, I'll always be watching over you. Remember to be kind, to laugh, and to trust that there are good people in this world who will love you as much as I do. By the time Samuel finished reading, tears were streaming down his face. He looked up at John, his voice breaking. Do you think he knew that something might happen? John swallowed the lump in his throat, pulling the boy into a gentle embrace. Maybe he just wanted to make sure you knew how much he loved you no matter what. The letter became a source of strength for Samuel in the weeks leading up to the hearing. He carried it in his pocket every day, a tangible reminder of his father's love and encouragement. The day of the final custody hearing arrived. The courtroom felt as imposing as it had months ago. But this time, Samuel sat with his head held high. John, seated beside him, exuded a quiet confidence. Though his heart raced with anxiety, the aunt's lawyer presented a familiar argument, insisting that family ties should take precedence. But John's lawyer countered with evidence of the stable, loving environment John had provided. Social workers testified about Samuel's progress in school, his improved emotional state, and the clear bond he shared with John. When it was John's turn to speak, he rose slowly, adjusting his tie before addressing the judge. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady but heartfelt. When I first met Samuel, he had just lost everything. His world had been turned upside down, and he was left to face it all alone. I didn't know then how much he would come to mean to me, but over these past months, he's become more than someone I care for. He's become my family, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure he knows he's loved, protected, and never alone again. The judge nodded, her expression thoughtful as she turned to Samuel. Do you have anything you'd like to say, young man? Samuel stood, clutching his father's letter in one hand. He looked around the room, his small frame steady despite the enormity of the moment. I don't remember my aunt, he said, his voice clear. She wasn't there when I needed her, but John was. He gave me a home, and he makes me feel safe. My daddy always said to trust the good people in the world, and John is one of them. I want to stay with him. A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening as she looked at the boy. Thank you, Samuel, she said kindly. After what felt like an eternity, the judge delivered her verdict. Full custody was awarded to John, her decision based on the undeniable bond between the two and the stable, loving home John had provided. Tears of relief streamed down John's face as he hugged Samuel tightly. You're staying. Samuel, you're home. That evening they celebrated quietly. John cooked spaghetti, a dish Samuel had once mentioned was his favorite, and they laughed as they recounted the day. For the first time in years, the mansion felt truly alive, filled with warmth and laughter, as Samuel drifted off to sleep that night. Clutching his father's letter, John stood in the doorway of the boy's room. He watched the steady rise and fall of Samuel's chest, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time, he felt he had not only found a purpose, but a family.